In October, two men in a warehouse in Milwaukee spent the first 10 minutes of their movie review show talking about how bad the box office looked. It was supposed to be a Halloween hangover episode, a casual rundown of horror movies they'd watched in October. Instead, it opened with a small, weary autopsy. This had been the lowest October box office in roughly 30 years. Horror hadn't delivered its usual safety net, and the old assumption that spooky season always saves the quarter suddenly looked very shaky. Nominally, they were talking about specific films. The Strangers trilogy that somehow diluted one movie's worth of material into 3 tedious theatrical releases, the Black Phone sequel that takes an elegant, self-contained premise and slowly chews it into homogenous franchise paste, Netflix projects that burn hundreds of millions of dollars only to be forgotten in a week, and a kickstarted indie horror movie from a YouTube critic that technically made its money back but nonetheless still felt like a failed experiment in leveraging parasocial relationships into online ticket sales. No one on camera leans forward and solemnly asks, is the film industry dying? They don't have to. The question hangs in the negative space between their jokes. It's there when they point out that horror, the one genre that's supposed to be almost bulletproof in October, mostly flopped, in Jay's words.
Mostly flopped.
Mostly flopped.
It's there when they talk about how the pandemic seems to have rewired everyone's brains, how streaming has trained people to wait for movies they previously would have taken a chance on in theaters, how both prestige and franchise horror keep being fed into the same meat grinder and coming out as homogenous content that barely justifies the cost to market it. The mood isn't panic per se, but it's definitely not optimistic either. It's closer to a tired shrug. This is the model now, and everyone involved is just trying to extract whatever they can before the whole thing seizes up. Over time, that tired shrug has hardened into the default posture of Red Letter Media's more serious videos. Not outrage, not activism, not even the old school Plinkett style pedantry about structure and character and the rules of cinema. What you get instead is a kind of dry, exhausted nihilism. Movies aren't sacred texts to be defended anymore. They're symptoms to be observed. Cinema is talked about as an IP pipeline. Theatrical releases are now weighed against their inevitable streaming afterlife, and the big existential questions about the medium are mostly converted into punchlines about Taco Bell the movie. The irony is that these are the same guys who once believed, at least theoretically, that movies could be fixed. A long time ago, in a region not too far away, Mike Stoklasa wrote the original Mr. Plinkett review of Phantom Menace himself, working from notes he and a friend took during a single viewing. Mike's long, rambling Phantom Menace review is built on the singular conviction that if you follow the rules of good storytelling, if you respect character and motivation and basic cause and effect, you can save almost anything. The early Red Letter Media project takes place in a world where the problem is bad decisions made inside a functional system. Change the people in charge, clean up the scripts, and the machine will start making good movies again. By the time you get to Halloween Hangover 2025, that faith has been eliminated. What you're watching now isn't a set of repair notes per se, it's more so a coping mechanism. The warehouse has quietly turned into a psychic pressure valve, 3 out-of-whack drives stuck in the same liminal space, trying to manage their shared disillusionment. One of them leans into appetite and absurdity, happy to bask in gore, junk, and stupid premises. One of them is still clinging to an idea of good movies and quietly cataloging all the ways the system prevents them from existing. In the middle sits the rational interlocutor, trying to knit those impulses together into a coherent vision of the future for cinema that doesn't so closely resemble hell. But increasingly, it would seem that hell is empty and all the devils are here. That attempt to narrativize the death of cinema is the real subject here. The balance that once made their dynamic feel oddly self-correcting has started to slip. When the ego can't plausibly pretend the industry will bounce back or that basic craft will somehow be rewarded again, it retreats into ironic detachment. You can see it in the way the discussion keeps looping back from specific films to the larger machinery that mangles them, then back again as if no one quite wants to stare directly at the conclusion. So they joke, they ramble, they compare horror franchises to failing restaurant concepts, and somewhere underneath all that, the same unspoken realization keeps surfacing. The thing they built their lives around is dying in slow motion. Perhaps it has been this whole time. And the only way to live with that is to turn its festering corpse into yet even more content. This is the story of how a long, obsessive complaint about Star Wars quietly turned into a totalizing theory of alienation under late capitalism. And how three middle-aged weirdos in a Milwaukee warehouse accidentally constructed a delicately balanced libidinal economy out of it. Id, ego, and superego trapped in a feedback loop, all trying to laugh their way through the end of cinema while the ego, stripped of any real power to reconcile fantasy with reality, settles for narrating the collapse itself. They didn't have to become the house band for that collapse. They could have pivoted into pure sketch comedy, gone full nostalgia shill, or quietly just walked away. What they actually chose to do was stay in the wreckage and keep describing it week after week until that description itself hardened into a career. Anyone who's ever tried to make something knows the feeling. In your head, the thing is complete. The movie plays perfectly in your imagination. The video essay is sharp, funny, airtight. Conversation where you finally explain yourself goes smoothly in the shower. Then when you sit down to write or shoot or to have a discussion, suddenly there's a budget. There's time pressure. Your skills don't quite match your sensibilities. Other people have their opinions and weird idiosyncrasies. If you're lucky, the finished product works, sort of, but it's smaller than what you meant. You can still recognize your original intention in there somewhere, but it's buried underneath a series of compromises and concessions. Hegel is the one who gives that mismatch a name. For him, mind, spirit, only comes to know itself by pushing itself outward into some object, a painting, a constitution, a church, a YouTube channel where you review garbage cinema. He calls this move something like self-externalization. You find out what you are only by turning yourself into something out there in the world. But the moment you do that, the thing has become separate from you. It's shaped by the constraints of reality, by the medium, by institutions, by money, by everyone else's responses. The cut of a scene depends on the shooting schedule. The tone of a joke depends on what advertisers will tolerate. By the time your inner life has hardened into a piece of content, it has become something slightly other than what you intended. Hegel said, "The life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it." There's no way to love something without also watching it die a little in the process of making it real. Art is basically a self-imposed grieving process with a production schedule. In any form of social organization, there's always going to be a gap between what you put into an object and what you get out of it. Marx takes that same insight and drags it out of the realm of vibes and into the world of commodities. In capitalism, the production process is organized and mediated through the commodity form. What you make doesn't go out into the world as a high-fidelity version of what you intended. It leaves you as a commodity and comes back as price signals, SEO performance, click-through rates, box office, watch time, etc. Your own activity reappears in front of you as something mediated by the abstract logic of the market. And so it goes something like this. All at once, the worker is estranged from the product of their labor, from the production process itself, from other people in society, and from their very own human nature. Later, Marx gives the structural side a different name, commodity fetishism, the way social relations between people show up as ostensibly objective relations between things. Our cooperation gets condensed into objects that, by virtue of the fact they can be exchanged on the market, appear as though they have a certain power all by themselves. This isn't merely a kind of psychological sleight of hand, rather it's how the market system has to appear in order to function. Out there in the world, labor shows up as a swarm of commodities that seem to obey the logic of the market. At the level of subjective experience, that same process tends to register as a sense that one's capacities and time are being routed through something opaque and external. For some people, that manifests as anxiety over metrics, for others as burnout, numbness, or a low-grade conviction that nothing they make really belongs to them once it enters circulation. For some, that alienation is expressed as an objective fixation on the one thing they truly loved as a child, the movies. And to be fair, that's as good an obsession as any. Film production is a perfect little case study for this phenomenon. Hundreds of people pour years of their lives into something that will ultimately be credited to a handful of big names and owned legally by a fictional entity with a logo. Money dictates the casting, runtimes, tones, and endings. Test screenings stand in for the audience as such. When people talk about studio notes, what they're really describing is a process whereby the abstract demands of capital get translated by disinterested middlemen into specific creative mutilations. Less sad, more quips. Can we lose the politics? Can we set the third act somewhere that plays well in international markets? And so on. The thing Red Letter Media intuited very early on and spent 15 years accidentally circling is that this alienation doesn't just affect the people who make films. It also shapes people who watch them and the people who talk about them for a living. In 2009, Mike Stoklasa uploaded a 70-minute review of The Phantom Menace, delivered in character as Harry S. Plinkett, an elderly, vaguely homicidal shut-in. For a minute, it really did feel like contraband. The video had this aura of something you weren't quite supposed to be seeing, a rant about a children's movie that kept drifting into deadpan jokes about murder and brain aneurysms. Everyone remembers the opening line about the film being the most disappointing thing since my son, because the internet loves a bit. What actually mattered, though, was the shift right after the bit. Plinkett doesn't just say this sucks and move on with his life like the rest of us did. He starts doing remedial screenwriting on Lucasfilm. The way in which the review fixates on structure is telling. Plinkett keeps running the same diagnostic tests. First, on protagonists. There's the Movie Making 101 segment where he spells out what a protagonist is using clear examples from other films, then turns to The Phantom Menace and asks the stupidly basic question: who is this actually about? He walks through the obvious candidates. Not the Jedi, who are on a weirdly procedural errand, not Amidala, who functions more like a moving piece of furniture than a subject, maybe Anakin, but he shows up halfway through the movie and he doesn't really know what's going on. The conclusion is that there is no real protagonist. The film is just stuff that happens to a database of lore. In one of the more effective bits, he cuts to people on camera and asks them to describe original trilogy characters without superficial references to their costume or job. People rattle off personality traits for Han or Leia without even really thinking about it. Then he asks them to do the same for Queen Amidala, and the whole exercise disintegrates. Nobody can get beyond, she's Natalie Portman. At the level of story logic and basic psychological legibility, the prequels are a void. The formal comparisons reveal a certain nostalgia for the way things once were. Plinkett lines up the opening of A New Hope next to the opening of The Phantom Menace. One gives you rebels versus empire in a single silent image. Tiny ship, enormous ship, an instantly readable asymmetry of power. The other gives you a trade dispute, a donut-shaped battleship, a conference room, and poison tea. Plinkett hammers that contrast because he's trying to name a feeling that a lot of people had at the time but couldn't quite articulate. Something essential is missing from the prequels, and it's not just a matter of too much CGI. On the surface, this is pure formalism. Talk about structure, pacing, blocking, show don't tell, and keep anything like history or politics totally off the table. The only potentially viable topic outside the bounds of the immediate text is its predecessor, and so intertextuality stands in for a truly historical way of thinking. But this kind of formalism is never really neutral. The urge to brush away historical context to act as if we're only talking about craft is itself a kind of defense mechanism. Formalists dance around the topic of history in order to avoid an uncomfortable fact. None of us encounter history directly. Nobody walks around inside of capital H history. What we get are traces and fragments, texts, images, movies, interviews, making of, featurettes. The big forces that shape our lives only ever reach us in mediated form, as something already edited, narrated, and framed in a certain way. Once you accept that, there's no clean separation between the film itself and the world that produced it, because the film is just one of the many ways that the world becomes visible to us. And that in turn makes the supposed safety of pure formal talk very attractive. As long as you only complain about pacing or characterization, you can frame yourself as the reasonable person who just wants the movie to be better. The moment you start asking what kind of history is being told here or what function this narrative serves, you're no longer a neutral technician. You've taken a position about what the film is and what it's doing. In a critical environment like red letter media's, where the worst thing you can be is naive about how the industry works, it's much safer to sound like you're only interested in craft and never in the larger arrangement that craft belongs to. This is especially true after decades of being told that history basically ended in the early 90s and we are now just managing brands and vibes, not living through conflicts. If you've passively absorbed that story, then looking for history in the guts of a Star Wars movie feels almost corny. Much easier to call it a question of weak protagonists and bad pacing and leave it there. In practice, all of this shows up in exactly the kinds of things Plinkett won't stop pontificating about. The weird non-protagonist structure, the hollow characterizations, the way the first images of the film are about a trade blockade instead of a more direct conflict. He almost demonstrates a kind of allergy to thinking historically. The review keeps insisting it's just doing movie making 101, but what it's actually registering in a displaced form is a whole historical shift in what Star Wars is really for. It's gone from a pulp adventure about rebellion to a high-concept mess as a result of the creator getting high on his own supply. If you zoom out a little, the whole review is basically a case study in alienated production. Over and over, Plinkett comes back to the same thesis. Nobody could tell George Lucas no anymore. He digs up behind-the-scenes footage where a room of producers and department heads watch a rough cut in stunned silence. Lucas half admits he may have gone too far in a few places, but it's really too late. Everything hinges on everything else. You can't cut Jar Jar without collapsing the pod race, you can't cut the pod race without breaking Anakin's arc, and so on. The script is bad, the structure is bad, the pacing is bad, and yet the machine is now too complex to fix without destroying itself. It's a kludge of dangling subplots, toy commercial set pieces, and digital noise, held together less by a cohesive narrative than by the gravitational pull of the Star Wars brand itself. Crucially, this isn't a story about some poor director being crushed by studio notes. Lucas is insulated from the usual forms of capitalist discipline. He owns the sandbox. And that's the problem. The usual friction points where a director, a budget, or a hostile executive might check a frivolous impulse have mostly dissolved. The Phantom Menace is what happens when you give one very powerful person the ability to externalize his imagination at industrial scale with minimal friction or contradiction. This isn't young, hungry Lucas trying to prove himself. It's end-of-career Lucas messing around with his private fetishes at industrial scale. There's no meaningful resistance in the process, no struggle with material limits, no producer saying, "We can't afford that," or "This joke is dead." And so the normal disappointment that occurs in capitalism when you're producing a film gets inverted. Instead of the world deforming your idea deforms the world around it. Everyone else has to adapt to the bad script because the bad script belongs to the guy who owns the whole operation. What's left is a direct interface between one guy's late-style obsessions and an enormous industrial apparatus built to extend Star Wars as an IP ecosystem. New planets, new ships, new creatures, all of them potential assets. And the fantasy behind the Plinkett review is very simple. If you could just reintroduce some form of discipline, basic narrative craft, someone in the room who's allowed to say this doesn't make sense, a second writer, an editor with veto power, you could theoretically rescue Star Wars. You could reverse the alienation. The right responsible adult could restore the original intention. The machinery is neutral, it just needs the right operator. That fantasy is everywhere in Plinkett's review. When he lists the exceptions to Movie Making 101, it's really just a roll call of directors with strong, coherent sensibilities. When he talks about collaboration, it's with this clear subtext. The first trilogy worked because Lucas was constrained by budget, by other writers, by crusty British character actors who refused to say stupid dialogue. The prequels failed because he became his own studio. Underneath all the jokes about pizza rolls and murdered spouses, Plinkett is basically describing what happens when a production ceases to be a genuine collaboration and becomes a one-man fiefdom that happens to employ thousands of people. The workers are still there, the craft is still there, but their input has been totally hollowed out. They're there to simply execute, not to shape anything. In other words, the review treats Lucas as a kind of rogue capitalist of the imagination. He owns the factory, he owns the tools, and everyone else is just along for the ride. And then Disney bought Star Wars. Disney did what a giant media conglomerate is structurally built to do. It took a drifting asset, rationalized it, standardized it, and squeezed it for profit. When Lucas finally stopped holding out and cashed out, selling the universe he'd treated as his private sandbox for decades, Disney trashed his late career sequel treatments and hired J.J. Abrams, the poster child of competent auteur, to make a Star Wars movie that looked and felt exactly like Star Wars in everyone's heads. On paper, this was the thing Plinkett had been begging for since the prequel reviews. Real sets, practical stormtroopers, film stock, the original lenses, a script that respected the basic 3-act structure. In his Force Awakens review, he even calls it a competent enough movie and then reaches for the metaphor of a gorgeous new house. All the rooms you expect, all the fixtures in the right places, a tasteful echo of the old home. You walk around it and think, nice. And then, as he puts it, you notice the termites in the wall and the load-bearing clown poster. This is where his shtick mutates. The prequel reviews fixate on script mechanics, character motivation, setups and payoffs, visual storytelling. With Force Awakens, the problem isn't that the gears are missing, it's that the entire machine is designed for something other than storytelling. Early on, he calls modern Star Wars a living nightmare that you can never wake up from until you're dead. And that's not just a joke about fan fatigue. He walks through the new cinematic universe reality. Marvel churning out films on a schedule, DC trying to copy the model, studios announcing trilogies and spin-offs before the first entry is even out. Star Wars, he says, is simply the next IP to be slotted into that pipeline. There will be a new movie every year from now until we're all dead. The nightmare is industrial. In the Plinkett framing, Disney's job is not to make films that function as stories, it's to keep a gigantic balance sheet in perpetual motion. The film exists to stabilize the brand exists to anchor the streaming platform exists to hold up the stock price, and the stock price exists to finance the next acquisition. You don't bring in a director because you want their strange personal vision, you bring them in as a recognizable avatar of creativity, and then impose market research, test screenings, and franchise-specific constraints. The whole process is really about cleaning up anything with even a minor whiff of unnecessary risk. What used to be an artwork becomes a delivery system for risk-managed cash flow. The soft reboot section of the review is where that logic really crystallizes. Plinkett lays out how The Force Awakens isn't just similar to A New Hope, it's almost a controlled experiment in reproducing A New Hope beat for beat. Secret plans hidden in a droid, desert nobody with a mysterious destiny, old mentor, cantina, planet-killing superweapon, trench run, dead father figure, X-Wings escaping a fireball. It's akin to Lucas's own notion of the different Star Wars trilogies rhyming with each other, but totally stripped of any pretense or artistry. In the prequels, repetition felt like Lucas's middle-brow attempt to thematically demonstrate how history repeats itself in certain unexpected ways. But in Force Awakens, the repetition is policy writ large. Plinkett's formalizing tendency taken to an extreme and weaponized at the behest of a faceless corporation. The film's job is to prove the brand still works on screen and to reassure shareholders that the iconography is still intact. Red Letter Media sits right at the fault line of that transition. They mocked proponents of the ring theory, the prequel apologists who tried to rescue Lucas with Baroque theories about hidden structure and political allegory, but the default assumption was still, if you had better taste and better discipline, you could fix this. You could write a stronger second act for the next installments. You could clarify motivations. You could introduce the protagonist earlier, change how the Jedi Order functions, adjust the staging. The fantasy is that a good script doctor could save the thing. By the time of the Force Awakens review, that fantasy is basically gone. Plinkett explicitly identifies the movie as a soft reboot scam and a product of the Hollywood machine with its factory logic, where 500,000 people in 10,000 departments crank this shit out. He still nitpicks because that's the whole bit, but the heart of the review is no longer, here's how to fix this story, it's, this was never really the point. The interesting movie, he suggests, would have been one about Luke trying to train Ben, the collapse of the New Republic, the concrete politics of how the First Order resurges, and who pays for a super weapon the size of a planet. Instead, all of that is exiled to implied backstory so that the foreground can be a safe remix of A New Hope. In other words, the prequels irritated him because they were clumsy attempts at telling a story. The Disney films depress him because they're reasonably smooth non-attempts. The tragic mismatch between intention and result that characterized Lucas's mess is now gone. The match is perfect now. A very expensive, competently assembled movie that openly prioritizes brand management over narrative coherence. The joke about Star Wars becoming an endless and pointless cinematic universe is only half a joke. In that light, the recurring accusation that Mike ruined Star Wars by endorsing J.J. Abrams in the first place almost plays like an allegory for this whole trajectory. In the original Plinkett reviews, Abrams is floated as a kind of fantasy solution, a technician of clear, propulsive space adventure whose work on the 2009 Star Trek seems to supply everything the prequels conspicuously lack. The underlying premise is reassuringly simple. The machinery is basically fine, the mythology is intact, and what's missing is a competent ego at the helm who respects how stories are supposed to work. When Disney eventually installs Abrams and delivers films that line up far more closely with that brief, the result is not a restored psychic balance, but a different species of disappointment. By the time of The Rise of Skywalker, Mike is half-jokingly forced into a defensive posture, insisting that he meant Abrams as a director rather than the writer, and that The Force Awakens only functions because Lawrence Kasdan is there to shore up the script, and no YouTube rant ever influenced a multinational acquisition anyway. Of course, all of this is defensible at the level of fact, but totally beside the point at the level of fantasy. The scenario Mike once proposed as the rational fix has finally arrived. Everyone hates it, he hates it, and the remaining options are either to admit that the original way of posing the problem was perhaps a bit naive, or to retreat into increasingly pedantic clarifications about what he really asked for. The latter is the obvious choice for Mike. At that point, the deeper issue comes into focus. The problem is not simply that the wrong people are making the films or that the brand is being mishandled by insufficiently rigorous storytellers. The problem is that what is being unconsciously demanded from the franchise is something no industrial apparatus can supply: the ability to go back in time and re-inhabit the historical and biographical conditions under which the original Star Wars first appeared. No combination of directors, scripts, or corporate owners can recreate the specific psychic situation of seeing that world for the first time as a child in a cultural landscape where it was still new. In that sense, the Abrams era doesn't just expose the limits of auteurist tinkering, it exposes the impossibility at the heart of the demand itself. You can swap out Lucas for Abrams, practical models for CGI, and back again, but you can't hire anyone to restore 1977 or to magically transform yourself back into the version of who you were when you didn't know how the story ended. So when Red Letter Media keeps reviewing these things, you can feel the original Plinkett project starting to invert. The abrasive that once focused on fixing scripts and respecting the characters starts to transform into something darker. This isn't broken because it's the wrong guy at the wheel. It's broken because the vehicle itself is a fucking accounting trick. And once you accept that, a new, considerably more thorny problem appears in the foreground. One that isn't just about Star Wars anymore. What does it do to people who have built their entire creative identity around caring about movies when the movies themselves have stopped being about stories at all?